So to start, I'll give you a little spiel about the Bee Campus USA that we have at UCI. So as you may know, UCI is a bee campus and it has been for a few years already. And if you don't know already, Bee Campus USA is a certification that we need to apply for annually. So it basically provides a framework for university and college campus communities to kind of work together and conserve native pollinators. And this can happen by increasing native plants or providing nest sites or reducing pesticide use on campus. And for this certification, UCI makes commitments to conserve native pollinators, and everybody kind of works together, like students and faculty and administrators, to carry out these commitments and make the campus a better place for pollinators. And now I'll pass it over to Phoebe to introduce our speakers for today.
Hello, everyone. So today we have the honor of Diane Campbell and Tobin Hammer joining us today. They're both doctors and professors in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Thank you guys again for agreeing to be a part of this webinar. We really appreciate it. We will have Dr. Hammer go first, followed by Dr. Campbell. So whenever you guys are ready.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Phoebe and Taylor, for organizing this and for everyone for being here. Let's see if this works. So you should be able to see, oops, I'm skipping ahead. Can y'all see my screen? Okay. So I'm an assistant professor in the Ecology Evolution department. I started here January 2022. And the two kind of main goals of the research in my lab are first to understand how host microbe symbioses work and evolve. We use bees as a model. We do a lot of experiments trying to gain kind of general principles into these kind of like tight interactions between the hosts and their microbiomes. But since we study bees, we're also really interested in doing science that could help contribute to bee conservation. And I'm going to focus on that kind of latter theme today. So that's my lab group. We just took that photo yesterday. And we have a snazzy new logo. And this is a native Californian bumblebee in a botanical garden in Laguna Niguel that we do a lot of our field research at. So you've probably heard about bee declines, the need to save the bees. And there are a number of bee species that are in decline. For bumblebees, which is a pretty main kind of focus of my lab's research, we have decent data, especially for Europe and North America, and about a quarter of the bumblebee species in North America are some level of vulnerable, the classification from the IUCN. For much of the world, as you can see on the right, we just don't actually have any data. And for most other bees, there's about somewhere on the order of 20,000 species of bees. And for most of them, you know, especially the ones that aren't as large and charismatic as bumblebees, we haven't been paying as much attention. We just don't really know. But the situation is probably similar for many other groups. And so there's a real need to understand what's driving these declines and also what we can do to prevent them. One of the multiple causes, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, of bee declines is disease. And so here I'm showing some data from a paper where they looked back in time with museum specimens to measure the prevalence of diseases in bumblebees that we know are declining. So these are 4 different species of bumblebees that are declining. And from 1980 or so up to the time of the study, we see some level of increase in the prevalence of these pathogens. It's not, 100% definitive that this is, a key driver of bee declines, but it's certainly, there's pretty strong evidence that it's one of the main factors. So since we know that disease is an important force kind of shaping the health of bee populations, of course, we need to know how we might kind of control the transmission and effects of these pathogens. Well, one kind of key element for bees and disease is flowers. So there's a lot of overlap, a lot of kind of indirect interactions between different pollinators at shared resources. And we know that bees will sometimes defecate on flowers. And so they're defecating and feeding on the same spot. And so there's a lot of opportunities for transmission of viruses, of bacteria, of gut parasites. And so we know that this is like kind of a key link in the transmission chain. But flowers are also potentially a solution as far as managing the spread of these diseases. And that might take the form of planting the right kinds of flowers, planting them at the right part of the season, and also just planting more flowers to provide food resources to support bee health and immunity. And this is just an example of how different flower species can have different effects on disease. And in this experiment, they tested different kinds of pollen from different plants in a mixture, and they measured the resulting infection loads of this parasite called Crithidia bombi that infects the gut of bumblebees. And as you can see, there's pretty strong differences where if you feed them buckwheat pollen, they have pretty high levels of disease. If you feed them sunflower pollen, there's very, very low levels of disease. So there's a lot of interesting kind of interactions between their diet and disease, and potentially also the gut microbiome, which I'll talk about in a second. So not all of the microbes that interact with bees are pathogens and parasites. Bumblebees in particular are really interesting because they have these very specific gut bacteria that we know have certain beneficial effects. And one of those beneficial effects is preventing other microbes, harmful microbes, from infecting the gut. So sorry, this is a little bit gruesome, but to show you kind of an image of what the bumblebee gut looks like if it's kind of uncoiled, it's very long. If you take a slice of that and look at it under the microscope, that's what we're looking at here. This is some work that I was part of as a postdoc. And this kind of outer scrunchy ring is the bee's gut epithelium. So these are the bee's own tissue, the bee's gut epithelial cells, the little blue dots are the nuclei. But on the inside, the kind of core of the gut, called the gut lumen, which is where the food passes through, you can see there's this kind of Christmas colored layer of cells. And these are the gut bacteria that only live in bumblebees. And we know from experiments that when they have these gut bacteria, they're more resistant to infection from that gut parasite Crithidia. And also we're finding in research my lab is doing right now, they're also more protected from opportunistic bacterial pathogens. Very similar to humans, we know that, often if you take antibiotics, that disrupts your kind of native gut microbial community, and that can increase your susceptibility to foodborne opportunistic pathogens. How can we leverage these beneficial bacteria? We're just starting a project now to take the first steps towards developing probiotics for bees. And the kind of like ultimate idea is that if we can find bacteria that we know have beneficial effects, if we can grow them, if we can inoculate them into bee colonies, well, I should probably just mention quickly here that bumblebees are both part of kind of our wild insect diversity, but we also, there's also companies that will raise them in the lab and sell them to growers, often for pollinating greenhouse tomatoes. And so there is this kind of small industry of bumblebee keeping for crop pollination. And so potentially we could use probiotics to kind of improve their health and performance, make them better pollinators. So there's kind of economic benefits for growers, but at the same time, reducing disease in these managed agricultural bees, and therefore reducing the chances of spillover into wild bumblebee populations. So there is some evidence that these managed bumblebees, we're growing them in large facilities, and then we're releasing them into, they often escape into the wild and can transmit diseases to wild bumblebees. So that's kind of like the long-term idea for probiotics. I was asked to say what my favorite pollinator is, and it kind of changes on a day-to-day basis, but I thought I would talk about Heliconius butterflies because butterflies are not kind of regarded as one of the most important groups of pollinators. They certainly visit flowers, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily accomplishing pollination. But there's this group of tropical butterflies called Heliconius that are very important pollinators for the plants they visit. And they're so interesting in a number of ways, and I could talk for the rest of the hour about Heliconius butterflies. I'll just give a couple kind of examples. And this was part of my PhD research. I actually raised this individual from the egg, and so that was really fun to see the whole life cycle. But one of the reasons they're really interesting is because they feed on pollen, and they're the only butterfly that can do this. So other butterflies will visit flowers for nectar, but nectar is mainly sugars, and there's a little bit of amino acids and some other nutrients, but it's predominantly simple sugars. But pollen has nitrogen in the form of amino acids and also lipids. And so basically, Heliconius have figured out how to extract nutrients from pollen, even though they have this proboscis that can't actually ingest pollen grains like a bee can. But they figured out a way to kind of leach the nutrients out of it on the outside of their proboscis. And that has led to them having the longest lifespan of any butterfly. They can live for several months, which is very unusual for butterflies. And that's because they have this source of nitrogen as an adult insect. So they're really cool. And actually, I should mention that we have some of these on campus. Adriana Briscoe, who's a professor in our department, has been doing work on these for many years and has some in insectaries at the UCI greenhouse. So, and we are just starting to do some experiments on the butterfly microbiome. I don't yet have the data to share, but we just completed a big experiment. So I'm excited to kind of do more work with butterflies alongside our bee work. So I think that's it. Maybe I'll hand it over to Diane.
Great. So my name's Diane Campbell. I'm also a professor in ecology and evolutionary biology. And I loved Toby's talk and his focus on the bee side of this. I'm going to focus a little more on what pollinators mean for the plants they pollinate. And I've been interested in a long time, really for my whole career, in how interactions with animal pollinators influence evolution in plants. And we're doing a lot of work now on how those processes are affected by climate change and invasive species, and what all this means for persistence of plant populations in the future. So nearly 90% of flowering plant species depend on animals for pollination. And there's a wide diversity of pollinators. The photos on this slide are just some examples of ones that my lab has studied. So hummingbirds, bees, long-tongued flies, hawk moths, syrphid flies, and this sweat bee here. And as a result, animal pollinators are critically important, first to plant ecology, to just the persistence of plant populations. They're dependent upon pollinators for reproduction, but also to how features of flowers evolve. And so what I decided to tell you about today is two kind of short vignettes about some work in my lab. And I'm going to first tell you about hawk moths and about how they influence reproductive isolation between related plant species. And this is some work that we've done out in the Colorado Rocky Mountains. And then secondly, I'm going to tell you about impacts of wildfires on diversity of pollinators here in Southern California. So first, looking at the impact of hawk moths on formation of new species. So if you think about how new species come about, one of the things that's required is that the species have to be to some extent reproductively isolated. They can't mate with each other too freely and still retain species integrity. So we've looked at how hawk moths are involved in this in a system where they're two closely related plant species in the genus Ipomopsis. So this one on the left, Ipomopsis tenuituba, is heavily visited by hawk moths. This is an individual of Hyles lineata. And the species on the right, Ipomopsis aggregata, is more often visited by hummingbirds. So we were really interested in how hawk moths would respond in terms of their behavior to features of flowers. And one of the features that insect pollinators respond to is the color of the petals. So insects have color vision. It works a little bit differently from human color vision in that they have receptors typically in the blue, the green, and the ultraviolet, which we do not. They also typically respond to a variety of odors. So if you smell a flower, oftentimes the chemicals that you're smelling, those scents are there in part because they attract pollinators. So you might wonder how you measure scent of a flower, how you can actually capture that. So on the left here, you can see a flower enclosed in a scentless bag, and we can sort of pull air from that bag through a tube that has a chemical absorbent in it, and then we can analyze what's captured by that chemical absorbent using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. And when you do that, you find out, first of all, that, and this is typical of many, many flowers, these flowers emit more than 50 different compounds. But there's one compound that's very, very important to the reproductive isolation. And that's this compound here that's called indole. And indole is emitted by only one of those two plant species, the Ipomopsis tenuituba, that's visited heavily by hawk moths. And moreover, it's emitted only at nighttime. So hawk moths typically forage right after dusk, and they may have another period of flight around dawn, but right after dusk is their primary foraging time, and that's when these flowers are emitting indole. So we wanted to know how hawk moths respond to indole, and you can find out something like that by essentially giving them a buffet of choices of different kinds of plants. So here they have a choice of 4 types. Red indicates Ipomopsis aggregata, white is Ipomopsis tenuituba, and if there's an indole symbol, that means that we added indole on the outside of the flowers in the amount that's normally emitted. So hawk moths have a couple of types of behaviors. When they detect a scent, they will follow that scent plume weaving back and forth across it until they encounter the source. In this case, it's a plant of Ipomopsis tenuituba. And we call that an approach. It's approached the inflorescence. Now, once they've done that, they may or may not actually visit the flowers to extract nectar. So here the long proboscis is inserted inside a flower tube. So what happened in this experiment? Well, if you look first at the red bars, those are the Ipomopsis aggregata. If we added indole to them, about 3 times as many inflorescences were approached by a hawk moth. So that was drawing them in to come near the plant, but they still didn't visit the flowers like they did for Ipomopsis tenuituba. That's what's shown by this hatching here. So there's something else involved besides flower scent, and that turns out to be flower color. So you can also manipulate flowers to be different colors. We actually painted them to give them the reflectance spectrum of the other species. So here's a flower just painted red over its normal red color. Here's one painted white to match Ipomopsis tenuituba. And now we have red flowers, white flowers, with and without indole. So look over on the left here, when we did that with Ipomopsis aggregata, if they have their normal red color, again, if we add indole, we do get more of the inflorescences approached, but they're not visiting. If we paint them white, in addition, then they would visit those flowers. And you can see the same thing. If you do the same experiment with the other species, they're normally white with indole, lots of hatching, lots of visits. If you paint them red instead, the hawk moths will still approach the inflorescence, but they don't visit. So they need indole to find the plant, and then they need this white color to be able to easily see the flower, orient at it, and insert their proboscis under really low light conditions. So both the scent and the color are very important in keeping those 2 plant species reproductively isolated. Okay, so let's move to Southern California then, closer to home. In our local ecosystems, what would sort of be here if we didn't have all this urbanization is primarily coastal sage scrub. And what you're seeing here is an area in El Morro Canyon in Crystal Cove State Park, so quite nearby, that burned in February 2022. This was the Emerald Fire. This is that same area. I just took this photo a week ago, so 2 years later, and you can see we've had a lot of growth, primarily of this yellow flowered deerweed in here. So there's been some recovery. So we were interested in how recent wildfire is affecting rates at which pollinators visit flowers in coastal sage scrub. And so locally, we have, of course, honeybees, Apis mellifera, and those are insects that have been introduced from Europe. They're not native to this region. There are also many species of bees that are native, and the figure on the slide is for the entire state of California, not just for Southern California, but several hundred species of native bees, and then flies, butterflies and moths, and hummingbirds. So very wide variety of pollinators. Okay, so this map shows the location of 2 fires in the Santa Ana Mountains. So to orient you, here we are at UC Irvine, where the anteater symbol is. And this area here burned in 2017, this area in 2020. And we went out to 7 sites that burned in 2020, 4 sites, we call these the medium or intermediate sites, that had burned longer ago in 2017, and 11 sites that had not burned. And we went out and looked at pollinators in 2 different years. So what did we find? So I'm going to show you, but want to kind of orient you to this graph first. On the x-axis, we have the number of flowers per meter squared. So in a little area that we were watching, how many flowers were there of all species? And on the y-axis is the number of flower visits by pollinators per hour. And there's 3 panels here for the recently burned sites, the medium burned sites, and the unburned sites. And I want to make a number of points about this. First off, we've plotted the honeybees in red and the native bees in blue. And you can see that those introduced honeybees account for most of the flower visits. So depending on the year, it was either 58% or 70% of all visits to flowers were made by this one species, Apis mellifera. So that's the first point. The second point is that these unburned sites have more honeybee visits. So there's some red dots very high up here for the unburned sites. And that's primarily due to visitation to black sage, Salvia mellifera, which is one of the shrubs in the coastal sage scrub that takes a while to recover after burn. So it can take 5 years or more to completely recover. And then a final point is that the honeybees, in terms of the number of visits you see, that's much more responsive to flower number. So even when you have more flowers in the plot, you don't get a lot more flower visits by native bees of any sort. And these are some of the ones that we saw, but you see this very sharp increase in honeybee visits. So they're recruiting foragers to these shrubs that are sort of mass flowering shrubs that provide a lot of resources for the honeybees. One other point is about pollinator diversity. So in this case, diversity is just the number of species. And these are plots of pollinator diversity versus diversity of flowers in the plot. And the general pattern is that when you have a more diverse area in terms of flowers, you also have more species of pollinators. And that's particularly so in these recently burned sites. So higher flower diversity leading to higher pollinator diversity. Okay, so finally you asked me to share my favorite pollinator, and I have so many favorite pollinators. I was debating between that little halictid bee that I showed you on the first slide, which was actually a little bee in an alpine area in New Zealand where there are no social bees. There are no honeybees and bumblebees. There's no large-bodied social bees. And there are many species of these very tiny bees that are extremely effective pollinators. So I almost chose that. But instead, I chose to show you this hawk moth that I talked about, Hyles lineata, because I have a video of it. And I thought it'd be fun just to watch it for a little bit. So here we go. They're almost as big as hummingbirds. So when you first see one, you can think, oh, there's a hummingbird. And then you look more closely. Wait a minute, that's an insect. So really, really fun to watch at these flowers. So that's it.
Thank you both. Those amazing presentations about your research. Thank you for adding in your favorite pollinator. Both ones that I didn't know much about, so thank you. All right, now we will move on to more general questions about pollinators. maybe a little less advanced than your guys' amazing research for our general audience. All right, Taylor, would you like to begin?
Yeah, our first question, just to get it rolling, is just could one of you give a basic description of what a pollinator actually is and what classifies something as a pollinator?
I'm happy to do that. So pollinators are any animal that transfers pollen from male reproductive parts of a flower, so from the anthers to female reproductive parts. So the stigma that forms part of the pistil. And what happens when the pollen is transferred onto the stigma is the pollen grain, which contains the male gamete, will then grow pollen tubes that go down the style into the ovary, and you can get then fertilization of the ovules and production of seed. And so it's really any animal that does that.
Just to add a little bit, animal pollination is a characteristic trait of angiosperms, the flowering plants. We also have pollen in gymnosperms that are typically wind pollinated, and that's why, like juniper pollen is a horrible allergen, because they're producing tons of pollen and releasing it into the air in the hopes that it'll land on a female cone of another plant. But angiosperms figured out how to make flowers that could attract animal pollinators, although many of them have gone back to wind pollination. But it's this kind of like magical trait that has like unlocked diversity in the flowering plants. And that's why there's so much, or it's a big reason there's so much more diverse than other groups of plants.
Thank you. All right, next question. Another general one, just give your definition of why you believe pollinators are important to the world, to yourselves, whatever you'd like to share.
Do you want to start this one, Toby?
Sure. I mean, definitely from the perspective of plants, as Diane mentioned, pollinators are really essential for reproduction for so many species. And so if we want to preserve plant diversity, then we need to preserve pollinator diversity. Of course, thinking about agriculture, many crops are dependent on animal pollination. Not all of them, there's a lot of wind pollinated crops, wheat and corn and so forth. But a lot of, especially like fruits and vegetables, require animal pollination. So there's that kind of practical side. And then, I would just say that, it's a very kind of enriching part of experiencing nature is to see animals on flowers interacting, and seeing these plant pollinator interactions is a great way to learn about ecology. And when we have like a diversity of pollinators, it's just very enriching. It's just like it's more fun to see 10 different species of birds when you're out on a walk than just pigeons. So a couple other reasons.
I'll just add to that actually the majority of plant species currently they have seed production that's limited by low levels of pollination. And what I mean by that is that if you actually hand pollinate the flowers, so you provide more pollen than they're getting naturally, they will produce more seeds. So not only are pollinators sort of necessary at one level for reproduction, but we're also in a situation where for a whole variety of reasons they're not doing as much as is theoretically possible to make for a lot of seeds. And that's quite important in agriculture, and that of course is why people bring in honeybees or bumblebees to supplement that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys very much. Next question is, why do you think some pollinators are in decline? And along with that, how do you think we could help those pollinators in decline?
Well, Toby showed that nice map of bee pollinators in decline, and they are, of course, the best studied, but there are also declines in other groups as well. And the single biggest factor is really the loss of habitat. So if you think about Southern California and what it used to look like, we've taken way more than 90% of natural habitat and turned it into housing and other forms of urbanization. So that's the biggest factor. There's also a sort of intensification of agriculture that emphasizes monocultures of crops and heavy use of pesticides. And so those are also not so good for native pollinators. And then climate change is an additional factor on top of all of that is exacerbating these declines.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And then there's also the potential for these different factors to interact. So, heat stress may make you more vulnerable to parasite infection. Or if you don't have enough floral resources at the end of the summer, and you're being hit, and the resources that you have are loaded with pesticides, then that can reduce your ability to reproduce and persist in the landscape. So these interactions can also be really important. But I agree with Dan that the kind of habitat loss, which involves the loss of food resources and also the loss of nesting habitat, which is really critical for bees, thinking about bees, is really the kind of like primary driver. And as far as what to do about it, I mean, it's a very big challenge. Of course, climate change is a big challenge, and that's one of the important drivers. But there are a lot of local things that we can do, and there's a lot more I think we could do at UCI. But simply providing more flowers and of plant species that attract and support diverse pollinators, and then not kind of contaminating them with pesticides is a really big piece.
Thank you both. To add on to that question, this one is specifically related to bees. What is colony collapse disorder, and how does it relate to the decline of bee populations?
So colony collapse disorder is a honeybee specific phenomenon. And I want to emphasize that because a lot of people think about bee problems and they equate that with colony collapse disorder. But this is a problem that became a very big concern for beekeepers about 10, what year is it, 15 years ago. And basically, large numbers of honeybee workers would leave the colony and never return. And there were huge losses over the winter, which is like a real critical kind of vulnerable period in the honeybee life cycle. And it's still not like 100% nailed down as far as what the cause is, but it seems pretty likely that viruses transmitted by mites are a big factor in that. So the mites, there's these invasive mites that have spread around honeybee populations around the world, and they chew into the bee and can regurgitate viruses into the bee. And so they're really good at spreading viral diseases. So the colony collapse has actually become less of an issue recently. There's declining kind of reports of colony collapse. So that's good for beekeeping and for the crop pollination that depends on honeybees. But it is kind of like a separate issue from stressors that are affecting wild bees and other pollinators.
Thank you. Next question is, how are pollinators affected by influxes in any invasive plant species?
Well, so generally, a particular species of pollinator is adapted to feed on the species it's evolved with. And so really native plant species. And they may have trouble extracting nectar or pollen rewards from other species with the same efficiency. And so often, you know, they can extract nectar from perhaps lots of plants, but it may take them longer to do so. And so they're not getting as much energy per unit time. And there's actually several studies in which people have removed invasive plants and then seen increases in the abundance of wild native bee populations. So they definitely can be affected by invasive plant species.
Just to add to that, one of my grad students has been surveying native bee communities in coastal wetlands in California, and invasive plants are the majority of the flowering plants in these habitats. And it's not great, but it is still supporting native bees. You know, most of her like collections or observations of native bees on flowers are on invasive plants. So on the one hand, they're certainly outcompeting native plants that might be better food sources. Well, I should also add that these bees are generalists. And Diane mentioned a large number of bees are specialists to some degree, but they're better than nothing. And so it's a little complex.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, there's a lot of solitary nesting bees that are quite specialized in terms of the pollen that they will feed to their developing young. And so if their particular host plant species aren't there, that can be a problem.
Yeah, and along those lines, we see them visiting these plants. We don't know how well that turns out as far as like the development of their offspring. So they may be collecting pollen and nectar because that's all there is around, but we don't know whether that is actually supporting development of the offspring.
Very interesting. Thank you. All right, on to the next question. Why are native pollinators so important compared to non-indigenous pollinators, like, for instance, the European honeybee?
So there's actually been some interesting studies in Southern California where they've looked at some of the common native plants. So that black sage that I talked about, Salvia mellifera, and another species of sage, and a species of Phacelia. And they looked to see at how good honeybees were at pollinating the flowers versus native insects. And so if you allow the flower just to be pollinated or visited by a honeybee rather than being visited by a native insect, you didn't get as many seeds. So the honeybees are not as effective at pollinating those plants. And in that case, it was likely because, you know, honeybees had a higher tendency to visit a lot of flowers on the plant before moving on to the next individual. And so what happens when a bee does that is you get a lot of movement of self-pollen. So it's within an individual. And if the plant is self-compatible, that may actually make seed, but those seeds might be less fit because of inbreeding depression. And so the offspring that are produced are less fit. And if they're self-incompatible, if they're incapable of forming a seed after selfing, then you don't get a seed at all. And so that behavior of honeybees was probably one of the contributors to making them worse pollinators in that case.
And there's a lot of plants that honeybees just don't even visit and one example are buzz pollinated plants. So buzz pollination is a form of pollination where the bee grabs onto the anther or to the anthers with her mandibles and vibrates her wing muscles at a specific frequency that causes the pollen to shoot out onto her body, and then she can groom it and collect it and bring it back to feed her offspring. And honeybees don't know how to do this. They haven't figured it out. So they have no interest in flowers where the pollen is like locked away and can only be extracted by buzzing. So there's a lot of native bees, bumblebees, carpenter bees, many other groups of bees that can buzz pollinate. And so they are important for those particular plants.
Okay, so then our second to last question is, if there's a bee swarm, what would be the best way to go about handling it?
Well, I guess if it's on campus, I would talk to facilities to deal with it. They've certainly dealt with bee swarms on campus before. I think I remember getting ZOT alerts about that. If it's at your home or something, I guess I would call an exterminator. I do get a lot of like requests to kind of safely rehouse bee swarms or to find some kind of shelter or sanctuary for these feral bees. And well, one issue is that these feral bees tend to be very aggressive. And most beekeepers are not interested in like rehousing these swarms because there's so many honeybees and they don't want super aggressive bees in their yards or farms. So it's kind of a bummer for those bees, but generally calling the exterminator is, well, that's the solution that I usually recommend.
I'll just add to that sort of what's going on when you see a swarm. So swarming typically happens when a queen leaves the hive to find a new nest, and she'll take some other worker bees along with her and leave a new queen behind. And so often those swarms are very temporary. They're just going to be there for a day or so, and then the group is going to move on. And that's what happens most of the time. And I've several times had swarms in my yard, and they just disappear after a day or two. So if you have one in your yard at home, I would say the best thing is just leave it alone. If it's still there and several days later, or particularly if it does invade a structure, if it gets inside a building and you have to remove it, then yeah, you want to call in a pro to do that for you. But a lot of times I'll just move on.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dan. Thanks. Yeah, unless they're really setting up shop, then they'll take care of themselves.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Now for our last question, what can people do to help support pollinators and raise awareness about their importance?
So one thing we've talked about already is that there are many types of pollinators, and there was sort of a lot of focus on honeybees, and particularly with concern over colony collapse disorder. But honeybees they're actually in many cases out competing our native bees and have led to decline in native pollinators. So one thing that's been seen in a couple of ecosystems in California, for example, in some areas in the Central Valley, is that the presence of honeybees causes a shift in the types of flowers that native bees are visiting. And so, I think one thing then to keep in mind is we really want to think about all the pollinators out there, not just honeybees. And so one thing you can do to really help with the whole diversity is, as Toby mentioned earlier, is to plant a diversity of flowers, and particularly native plant species. So, if you've got a lot of native plant species in your yard, you're going to attract a lot of different kinds of native pollinators. And I think thinking about it from that whole ecosystem point of view is important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mentioned pesticides, and that's not necessarily not using any pesticides at all, but just thinking really carefully about when and where and which kind of pesticides are applied. And, there's some interesting research showing that even herbicides can be harmful for bees. So even things that we think of as being innocuous to animals can be harmful. And the microbiome is one way that these chemicals can impact bee health. And there's also nesting habitat. Most bee species are ground nesting and they need kind of exposed bare dirt. And that can be a limiting factor in some cases. If there's just everything is concrete. And bee hotels are sometimes considered as a way to provide nesting habitat for cavity nesting bees that like to nest in little cavities. But there's some issues with those. They tend to like accumulate parasites, and if you don't clean them every year, then they can actually do more harm than good. And some studies have found that bee hotels tend to attract species that are already very common and don't seem to support, they don't preferentially support rare species. So I tend not to recommend bee hotels, but just maintaining kind of undisturbed, or maybe disturbed, just kind of habitat for bees for nesting.
Okay, well, that's all the questions that Phoebe and I put together. So thank you guys so much for answering all of them. And now we can open it up and see if anybody else has any questions they would like to ask.
Yeah, I was wondering, are there any pollinators that pollinate intentionally, where they seem to go around the flowers with the goal of pollinating them?
Well, for the most part, pollinators they're out for themselves, right? They're going to the flowers because they want the food that's being offered, or in some cases there are flowers that mimic females of a particular insect species, and a male insect will go to the flower thinking that he's going to find a mate. But they're out for themselves. There are some very, very specialized systems. So I think here of figs and fig wasps, where the pollination is done by an animal that also has its young develop inside the flowers. So the fig wasp is both pollinating the fig, and the young are developing inside the fig. And so in that case, I suppose you could say that it's intentional, but it's still, that's because it's increasing the fitness of the fig wasp. It's not because it has a concern for the fig.
Yeah, another really cool example of active pollination is with yucca moths. So like Joshua trees, if you've seen those, they have this very like obligate specialized moth pollinator that, as Diane mentioned with the figs, it's the same situation where they're actively kind of transferring pollen to support, and they lay eggs, and the eggs will eat the developing seeds. But there's this interesting tension between the plant doesn't want any seeds to be eaten, but it wants to be pollinated, and the pollinator wants as many offspring to develop as it can. So it's kind of a cool system.
Thank you,
That's really
Michelle.
interesting. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions before we end for today? Eileen has a question in the chat. She says, for fall, are you looking into recruiting undergrad for pollination research?
I would encourage you to email us, and maybe we can. For me personally, I'm not exactly sure about the fall, but definitely feel free to get in touch.
Okay, if that's the last question, then I think we are going to end for today. Thank you again so much for everyone who came and who has gone to class, I assume. Thank you again, Dr. Campbell and Dr. Hammer, for joining our webinar. We really appreciate it, and we really enjoyed what you shared with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.